Porque os brasileiros estão lendo romances de escritores africanos? Why should Brazilians be reading novels by African writers? Olá, meu nome é Manu Herbstein. Eu sou autor, romancista. Eu sou da África do Sul e da Gana. Me desculpe, mas eu não falo português. So, I'll continue in English. I met my good friend, the young Brazilian scholar Gustavo Brito, at the conference of the African Literature Association at the University of the Witswatersrand in Joanesburgo, South Africa, in April 2014. He was the only Brazilian there. I told him that two of my novels, Ama, A Story of the Atlantic Slave Trade, and Brave Music of a Distant Drum, link Africa to Brazil in the era of the transatlantic slave trade. I guess that's why he asked me to make this video. My first novel, Ama, A Story of the Atlantic Slave Trade, is set in the late 18th century. It tells the story of a young woman who is enslaved in what is now northern Ghana. She passes through the Asante capital Kumasi and is then sold to the Dutch at Elmina, the castle which had once been the center of the Portuguese slave trade. She ends up in a sugar estate, un engenho, in the Reconcavo of Bahia. The novel has 4 sections and an epilogue. The third section, The Love of Liberty, has this short prologue. African slaves were sold in Lisbon as early as 1441. The European discovery and colonization of the Americas set the scene for the transatlantic slave trade, which lasted from early in the 16th century until the second half of the 19th. The slaves were all African. So too were many of those who sold them. The buyers and shippers were almost all Europeans. In the course of 400 years, upwards of 10 million black men, women, and children arrived in the Americas as unwilling immigrants. Millions more died during the journey to the Atlantic coast and at sea. The fourth section of the novel is entitled America, which in this case means Brazil. Its prologue reads like this. At the end of the 20th century, the population of Brazil stood at some 165 million. Of every 10 Brazilians, 6 are descended wholly or in part from African men and women who were transported across the Atlantic against their will during the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. Finally, in the epilogue, we read this. The slave trade was formally abolished in Brazil in 1850, but those who were responsible for implementing the law came from the class of slave owners. It was not until 1888, after widespread disturbances and mass defections by slaves who had lost their patience and were prepared to wait no longer, that the institution of slavery itself was finally outlawed. In 1891, the Brazilian Minister of Finance decreed the abolition of history. He ordered the destruction of every document which dealt in any way with slavery or the slave trade, a nationwide burning of the books. But the clamor of voices from the past drowns out the fiats of forgotten bureaucrats and demands to be heard. At the end of the 20th century, the more than 100 million Brazilians who are of African descent remained overwhelmingly poor. Political and economic power still rested firmly in the hands of the descendants of the Senhores de Engenho. Ama is a story of the slave trade, a story of Africans who were carried across the Atlantic against their will. The end of this story has yet to be written. In 2002, my novel Ama, A Story of the Atlantic Slave Trade, was awarded the Commonwealth Writers' Prize for the best first book. This is a picture of Princess Anne, the daughter of the British Queen, making the presentation to me. There is a paradox here. Throughout the 18th century, the British were the world's most successful slave traders. But that is yet another story which has yet to be written. Brave Music of a Distant Drum is a sequel to Ama. In it I have attempted to address the question of how the children of enslaved and transported Africans came to terms with their African identity. That issue remains very much alive today. I have never visited Brazil. That said, you might wonder at my impudence in writing these books. This is my defense. The Brazil I have written about is that of the late 18th century. Apart from the issue of language, my guess is that present-day Brazilians are as much strangers to that world as I was. I read a great deal. If you're interested in the sources of my research, please go to the webpage www.ama.africatoday.com/america.htm. At that page, you'll find the menu which you see on the left-hand side. One of the books which I found most useful in my research was this, Katia Matoso's fine rediscovery of that lost world, To Be a Slave in Brazil. I strongly recommend it. The Portuguese edition is called Ser Escravo no Brasil. Another was this, Robert Edgar Conrad's Children of God's Fire, a collection of 117 surviving documents covering all aspects of slavery in Brazil, from its beginnings in Portugal and Africa in the 15th century to its abolition in 1888. And yet another is Stuart Schwartz's Sugar Plantations in the Formation of Brazilian Society, Bahia, 1550 to 1835. This is a book I haven't read because it's in Portuguese. It describes a long-lost and forgotten cemetery in Rio, in which the bodies of slaves who had died soon after their arrival from Africa were buried in shallow graves, naked, without any religious ritual, prayer, commendation, or sacrament. If you're in Rio, please visit it and pour libation to the spirits of those who were buried there, and reflect on its significance regarding the relationship between Brazil and Africa. So far, I've tried to persuade you that it might be worth your while to explore the historical and cultural relationship between Africa and Brazil. I haven't yet mentioned a single book by an African writer, except my own. Please be patient. I'll come to that shortly. But before I do so, I want to suggest and recommend a few books by Brazilians. Here is the first, which, if you have children, you might read with them. And here are two more, in which the Brazilian historian Alberto da Costa e Silva demonstrates the intimate links between our continent and your country. I highly recommend that you continue with a brilliant classic novel, A Casa da Água, written by the Brazilian author Antonio Olinto. This is available both in the original Portuguese, published by Bernardo, and in an English translation, The Waterhouse, which I have read twice. It links Brazil to West Africa in a moving and fascinating manner. I come now to make recommendations to Brazilian readers who might be unfamiliar with fiction written by African writers. My guess is that it might be best to start with stories written in Portuguese. I'm on shaky ground here, because I've read only a few of these from the short list of those books which have been published in English translation. So I'm going to mention a large number of books which I haven't read. I've built up these lists by searching at www.amazon.com.br, where with diligent searching I found more than I had expected. My first choice is a book which I have read in English. Luis Bernardo Honwana is the Mozambican author of just this one work, a highly influential volume of short stories entitled Nos Matamos o Caotinhoso, first published in 1964 and translated into English as We Killed the Mangy Dog and Other Stories. Here are the covers of 14 books by the Angolan writer José Eduardo Agualusa. If you can't make out the titles from the illustrated book covers, just search on Agualusa's name at the Amazon Brazil website. Here are a few of them. Teoria Geral de Esquecimento, O Vendedor de Passados, published in English as The Book of Chameleons, and Nassau Criolla, which is partly set in Brazil. Here are the covers of 12 novels by another Angolan writer, Pepetela. Again, look at Amazon's Brazil website for details of these novels. I've read and much enjoyed the English version of Jaime Bunda, Agente Secreto. Here the covers of 10 novels by yet another Angolan writer, Onjaki. Again, look for the details at Amazon's website. The Mozambique writer Miokuto has recently been awarded the prestigious 2014 Neustadt International Prize for Literature. You can find details at the website neustadtprize.org. I've read Vozes Anoitecidas, a collection of short stories published in English as Voices Made Night, but I must read more of Kuto's writing. At the 2014 African Literature Association conference, my friend Gustavo Brito gave a live translation into English of Miokuto's presentation in Portuguese. The writers I've mentioned so far have all been men. Here are works by two women writers. Lilia Momple's Neighbours was translated into English from the original Portuguese. Momple's other novels are Ninguém Matou Suhura, No One Killed Suhura, and Os Olhos da Cobra Verde, The Eyes of the Green Snake. Here are two novels by another Mozambican woman, Paulina Chiziani. I haven't found her other novels at Amazon Brazil. Finally, here are links to two interesting websites concerned with writing by African writers in Portuguese. The website of the União de Escritores Angolanos, UEA, and the website of the Pan-African Writers Association, PAWA, which is based in Accra, Ghana, where I live. I come now to novels written in other languages, principally English and French, which are available in Portuguese translation. Here for a start are three by the great Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe: Things Fall Apart, No Longer at Ease, and Arrow of God. Sadly, there doesn't seem to be much else. A few by Nobel Literature Prize winners Nadine Gordimer and J.M. Coetzee, and hardly anything by Africa's other Nobel Literature Prize winner, or one of them, Wole Soyinka. But there is one exception, Sefi Atta's fine coming-of-age story set in Lagos, Nigeria, Everything Good Will Come, a favorite of mine. In recent years, there has been a great flowering of new fiction by African writers in English, particularly by Nigerian and South African writers. If you are prepared to read some of their work in the original English rather than in Portuguese translation, the best I can do is to offer you links to several excellent lists. And here are some more links to more excellent lists. The Africa Book Club is a first-class website featuring reviews of the latest books and interviews with authors, including one with me. My final word: if you are a Brazilian publisher and you'd like to consider publishing one or more of my own novels, please do send me an email at manuherb@gmail.com. That's Manuherb, MANUHERB @gmail.com. I wish you enjoyable and stimulating reading. Let us strengthen our transatlantic bonds.